Love, love, love till I be but breath of the Spirit flowing in me.
Welcome to the Spirit of Life program. My name is Lucia Pace, and today I have a very special guest from another faith, Rabbi Shimon Cowen. Rabbi is going to be sharing his story with us and also the common fundamental values between Judaism, other religions, and Christianity. Welcome to our program, Rabbi.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be on it.
Thank you. Rabbi, perhaps we can start, and if you can just give us a sketch of your background and what influenced your life's work in this work that you're doing now in terms of finding that common denominator amongst all faiths.
Well, of course, the beginnings of my early background, I was not yet religious. But there were very important ingredients in that background which came to figure very strongly in what I subsequently did. Some may know that if they paid attention to my name, the name is Cowen, and my father is, or was, Sir Zelman Cowen,
yes,
Governor General of Australia. And of course, his appointment to that position occurred already when I was a PhD student. And when I was 26, a bit earlier than that, to tell you the truth. But at all events, it was a family which was an extremely cultured family, a family which had been in a number of interesting positions. My father was twice a vice-chancellor, once of the University of New England and once of the University of Queensland. A very cultured home, a home wide open to the arts and sciences. Very interesting people came into it. And I could say in a way that that kind of a background gave me, and maybe this combined also with a natural proclivity in my own nature, it gave me a real taste and an interest actually in the totality of the arts and sciences, a full sense of the culture of our society, a sense of civilization, the dimensions of civilization, the arts and sciences. So my father was one who was, of course, his whole business, in a sense, was to cultivate knowledge, inquiry, and I'm sure people know that they were very special people themselves, my parents. However, what I took from that was essentially an openness to the intellectual and the cultural world in the broadest sense in which we live. In other words, to a sense that we live in a civilization, the dimensions of this civilization. And therefore, to be a conscious, useful human being, it's important to know what kind of a society in the broadest sense one belongs to. Now, at that stage, I wasn't yet religious. My parents never repressed their religious identity, but by the same token, they did not have had not had a very intensive education in their own Judaism. And we never concealed it. We observed the festivals, but it was not with a great deal of knowledge or involvement. So if you're asking me, what was the principal input?
Influence,
That's
yes.
right. From that background, I'll say in a word, it was a sense of openness to society and the world of ideas in the broadest sense. And also, I was very privileged, being in a household like that, to have access to people of influence, people of prestige, people who've made major contributions to politics, arts, knowledge, and so on and so forth. And I think in some way that has been a blessing which has stayed with me, and no doubt in significant part in the merit of my parents. My father and mother were who they were. My father no longer with us, unfortunately, but my mother is. And in their merit, I think, the doors have always been open to the worlds of politics, to the worlds of art, and the worlds of science, to the worlds of the humanities. And I think that this passport, if you like, to the world, to civilization, the realm of ideas is something which has been a tremendously important thing. Now, that was where I started from. But if you want to ask me about my journey to where I have now come, or where I came, let us say let's say some 35 years ago, well, that's a different story. But I'll let you ask the questions there.
Well, I'm interested now, Rabbi. That's a wonderful, colourful illustration that you've given us in your explanation, and no wonder you're doing the work you're doing now, because I can see how that has contributed to the message you're giving to the world right now through your books that you've written, and also through the meetings and the forums that you have with politicians. Is that right?
Certainly,
yes.
It is.
So I'm interested to know now is where did the shift come from secularism, that cultured life that you had in your family, to that turnaround point in being open and now becoming a rabbi in your life?
Well, it's interesting.
To religion, to your religion.
It's a very important question. It was the question as far as my life is concerned. Even though I did not consciously come back to my own Judaism until I was about 26 years old, and then in the middle of a PhD. I can see throughout my whole, late schooling and undergraduate studies, a questing. I felt that whilst all the excitement of ideas and culture was there, and I, avidly explored it, I think I had, there was something was niggling at me. I don't think I felt, I must have had some sort of a spiritual hunger. Even though I wouldn't have put it in those terms. And I can tell you, I don't know how interesting my personal details are, but I became a terrible insomniac as a university student.
Okay.
And I think that in retrospect, that has to do with the fact that there was something, where there were
restless, restlessness.
Deep, unanswered and unsupplied needs and questions.
Right.
And there may have been a soul sense which was perhaps waiting to be satiated.
Well, Rabbi, we have to go to a break now, but I'm very interested in coming back to finding out what that more element was. You're watching the Spirit of Life program. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly. Hello, welcome back. You're watching the Spirit of Life program, and my guest today is Rabbi Shimon Cowen, from another faith, obviously, who is sharing the fundamental values that we share amongst all world faiths, and Christianity, of course, which is included in that. So welcome back, Rabbi.
Nice to be with you.
Rabbi, before the break, you were explaining how the shift came from secularism to your interest in religion.
Well, I was certainly indicating perhaps an unconscious questing. It had not become in any way yet a religiously steered project. To take up the story, I finished my last 2 years of an undergraduate degree in Canberra. And that was, of course, pursuing most interested and intrigued again is how do we understand the arts and sciences, if you like, as a whole. That's, I mentioned, that was my past. That's the background I came from, and I was I'm a bit of an abstract thinker, and my BA thesis actually looked at the relationship between science, culture, art, and society itself. So we're looking at the total picture. Now, after my first degree, I went to Germany, and there, as some of you may know, some of the viewers may know, we have a culture which is renowned for its speculative philosophy. And I became, by way of some preliminary studies, what would then become a PhD. That was why I was supposed to be there. I came in contact with the thought of some great German thinkers, Hegel, and a more modern thinker, also a great thinker, and also in the tradition of Hegel, called Theodor Adorno. they were also very much concerned with understanding knowledge in its totality, and I suppose you could say the understanding of what civilization is, but civilization grasped in ideas philosophically. Now, I was those were years of remarkable intellectual freedom. I came back to Australia and I began a PhD. And during this PhD, I had an intellectual turning point, a crisis. I was, as I mentioned before, I was something of a little bit of a philosopher. I was trying to sort of patch together my own view of the world. And whilst I can't remember exactly how it happened, something occurred intellectually to me which sent this whole house of cards, intellectual house of cards, tumbling down. And my whole intellectual investment seemed to have collapsed before my very eyes. I then scrambled to rebuild it. And in the middle of that, it occurred to me, what am I doing? I am trying to impart meaning to the world. I am giving sense to reality. In fact, what is this? This is just, if I produce anything at all, it will just be another philosophical creation, another edifice of thought. And I began to think, this is just, these are just projections. These are just, I'm making of reality in my own image. And this struck me very deeply. And I had a sense of a tremendous sort of intellectual decentering. And in a word, what that meant was I began to think maybe I, the thinker, am no longer the center of the universe, making sense of it, but maybe I am a creature. Maybe I am on the periphery. Maybe there is a center of meaning much greater than me, and it's rather foolish and purposeless for me to try to say that I can make sense of it all, which of course is the beginning of a religious perception. When a person realizes that his or her intellect and being is finite, and there's something much greater, much deeper, and more fundamental than one's own finite capabilities and finite endeavors and structures and struggles to make sense of things, then you're already on the way to realizing that you are a creature and not a so-called, not a creator.
How fascinating.
So this is something which actually shook me very, very deeply.
Yes, it would.
As an intellectually oriented person,
yes,
this had consequences for my whole being. And I experienced a moment of radical humility. And unfortunately, at that point of time, I was approached by the little synagogue in Canberra to participate in its activities. I had nominally done so in the past, but this was the right moment, because I was ready now to open up a new faculty within me, which is the soul, as distinct from the intellect. I had a sense now of my creatureliness. I had a sense that the intellect is a wonderful thing, but it's not the source of ultimate understanding and truth. And so I began actually to revel in the disclosure of a faculty within myself which I'd been little aware of, so perhaps only of occasional moments and flashes throughout my childhood, which is my soul. The soul, of course, is the mirror of God. The soul is that with which we communicate with God, which is made in the image of God. So once that spiritual faculty, which was now no longer impeded by intellectual imperialism, me having to make sense of the whole world creation, I'm ready to hear, I'm ready to listen, I'm ready to realize there's something greater than me, greater than my understanding, greater than my intellect. There's a true center. I'm not the center. Let me now be a recipient of it. So I now entered into an experiential relationship with my own faith. And that was a very great thing. And I discovered something within myself which unfortunately much of society does not know about, which is the soul.
Wow, how interesting. I'm fascinated to hear the rest of your story in how what you heard when you were listening to your soul speaking to you, and what's come out of that for you in terms of your past intellectual acquisition, accreditation, knowledge, and now this religious invitation to your soul. We're just going to go for a break now, Rabbi, and we'll be back to take that point up after the break. We'll see you back shortly. Welcome back. My guest today is Rabbi Shimon Cowen, who is sharing his story with us, as well as his understanding of the common values that all world religions have. Rabbi, before the break, you were talking about you now entered into a new faculty in your life, in your heart, in your mind, in your being. You started to understand that your soul was beckoning you, not your words, but my words, of your understanding of what you were saying, of understanding what you were saying. You were being beckoned to something more. What is it that you heard? And how? And was it in conflict to what you already knew?
Well, of course, when we speak about beckoning,
yes,
that it certainly was. And that's a very deep experiential thing that we feel. But you have to understand, and I suppose this was particularly significant for me because, as I mentioned, I come from an intellectual and cultured background, that intellect does not have to be suspended when one is in that, when one is in the spiritual mode. And in fact, we have theology. Theology is thinking about religion. It is religion conscious of itself. So I suppose that one of the things that I did as soon as I began to feel this spiritual need, apart from realizing that ultimately it's beyond intellect, ultimately it is beyond intellect, but intellect needs to be engaged. And intellect becomes engaged by thinking in theological terms. And we know, for example, there are basic categories of theological thought. And the three famous categories are creation, there's a God, there is revelation, there is the way of life, there are the values, the teachings which God has for us to follow. And there is a concept of redemption, which is a notion that we're moving towards a time when godliness will actually be manifest within the creation itself. Now, so therefore, when you speak about the beckoning, already, that spirit thinking in these terms, this is intellectual, but it's intellect at the service of the soul. We're thinking about spiritual concepts. Mm-hmm. So then the next major task for me was to see how these theological ways of seeing the world, in other words, the way in which the soul sees the world, we use with employing intellect as for theological understanding. How can that now be brought into interface, into relationship with the secular sciences, art and culture? In other words, does the fact that I was now religious mean that art would cease to exist, and science would cease to exist, and history would cease to exist, and music, and all of these things? No, it can't be. We cannot jettison the accomplishments of creation. And in fact, this is what makes civilization into what it is. It's the material, it's the intellectual and material expression of ideas. So the question was now, how can these two worlds speak to each other? You have now we understand that the highest faculty in the human being is the soul. And therefore, ultimately, one sees life in theological terms, in terms of creation and revelation and redemption. God is part of one's life. But now, how will we return to all of these different realms and talk to them? Do they have to be two separate things? A person has a need for integration. We need to integrate our deepest beliefs with our understanding and our relationship to the world and what society actually is. It doesn't mean that we're going to accept what society is doing, lock, stock and barrel, but we have to understand what would be the condition for a psychotherapy which was cognizant of religious values. What would be a fine arts which gave a place to the spiritual? How does science acknowledge God? In other words, How do we now begin to put all of these things together? How does religion relate to the world? And I became aware also that in many ways that the secular mind too, in a very certain, rather inverted way, is also thinking in theological ways, but it is not without God being explicitly in its language. Now that is quite a cryptic statement, and I don't know that I can explain it right now. But at all events, put very simply, the world and godliness should not be two separate things. They should come together. And that, I think, became now my essential goal and task. So my first task was to acquire a level of Jewish studies, religious studies, which was comparable to the secular knowledge which I had. So I had a PhD, and now I became a PhD, and I also became a rabbi. But then, during the many years which I spent in a postgraduate rabbinic institute, I now began to undertake various kinds of explorations in the relationship between Judaism and psychotherapy, Judaism and the natural sciences, Judaism and the fine arts, Judaism and philosophy. Later, I would be interested in the universal values, which we'll talk about in due course. But at that stage, it was very much focused on Judaism. And my goal was, how do we in fact make the world and godliness come together? And I'm speaking this is in the plane of the higher sciences, the higher arts. In fact, that area which you would have thought was the most inimical, most estranged from religion. No, the highest faculties of civilization, its arts and its sciences, that's what needs to be illuminated by religion. It's what needs to speak articulately to religion to have an articulate communication between the two. That in a way became my personal program in my own modest way.
Rabbi, wow, it's my reaction to that. You are an amazing man. What I'd like to say now is, I believe you've written a book called, recently, you've written more than one book, but recently you've released a book known as Politics and Universal Ethics. And you're also the founder and director of the Institution for Judaism and Civilization. I wonder, we've run out of time, and I'm just wondering whether you would be kind enough to come back and be our guest next week on this program to talk more about the context of this book and what's evolved from this new phase of knowing in your life.
With pleasure.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. It's been my pleasure to have you as my guest today.
Thank you.
You've been watching the Spirit of Life program. We'll see you again next week, same time, same place. Take care.
Bring it to